Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm returning to a subject I've looked at before, which is misinformation, with a guest that I've spoken to before, Professor Magda Osman. And I wanted to get Magda back on the show to look at this subject again because she's been doing some fascinating research that shines a slightly counterintuitive and unusual light on the subject of misinformation. Because on the face of it, trying to ban mis or disinformation seems like a good idea. If we know something is likely to mislead people, then we should probably think about restricting or banning it. That's, of course, why most countries regulate advertising. But what if there was a good reason not to ban it? And that's the perhaps surprising conclusion that Magda's research has produced. So in this episode, I'm going to delve back into the topic of misinformation and disinformation, what those things are, how they're currently regulated, and how they impact society. And Magda helps me to think about whether labelling dissenting information as misinformation and banning it from communications channels is actually the right approach. What's fascinating is that, as Magda explains, exposure to false news or information doesn't necessarily lead to negative behaviour. Before we finish the discussion, we move into an area we weren't expecting to talk about, but which is kind of related and really fascinating. Does adding more labels to food help people to make better choices? Can it actually change consumer behaviour? If you've heard Magda before, you'll know that you're in for a real treat here. If you haven't, then remember to check out her previous appearances. Before we begin this episode, my usual reminder to you that my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out now, available from all good bookstores, and I presume some bad ones as well. There's a link to that in the show notes. With all of that said, this was a really joyous episode to record, so stand by for an episode all about misinformation and why potentially we shouldn't think about banning it. Magda, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Hello.
Hello again. Look, it's great to have you back here. And people that haven't heard your previous appearances on the show can just look in the show notes and listen to those. But you're back with us to talk about something else that you've been looking at that I think is incredibly interesting: misinformation. Tell us about that.
Well, it is interesting. But it's also quite curious because, well, for a few reasons. Now we've just, we're awash with worry about misinformation. And we kind of take for granted what we think it means. And then the implications of it. And there's a kind of logic to it, which I and my colleagues that have been working on this for a while have tried to sort of look at properly. So I'll kind of talk through the logic of it, and then we can sort of riff off that.
Cool.
Which is, there's kind of three parts to this. So the first is, well, do we know what misinformation means? And then if we just have, let's say, a shared understanding of it, what are the assumptions? So the assumptions are that we encounter some misinformation that either builds on a prior belief that we have, or it changes or introduces a new belief. And then from that, the belief changes our behavior, right? So because you can't follow the problems to do with misinformation if you don't agree on, well, one, what is it? What is it supposed to do in your head? And then from that, what is it supposed to do for your behavior? Right? Because if we're worrying about it, we're assuming that it's doing something in our head. And then from that, we then go off and do something that is bad. So
I love this idea of I'm really worried about misinformation. What is it? No idea. Right. And there is a little bit of a thread of that nowadays. People complaining about stuff they don't really understand. So while you're making a really simple point that we have to know what it is and we have to think it's significant, there's no point in worrying about something that has no impact.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I love this. I love this idea that let's go back to basics and let's think about, is it worth concerning ourselves with? And implicitly, we're going to come on and say, obviously, yes. Otherwise, we're recording an episode of it. But so tell us what it is.
Well, I mean, it's actually a poorly defined term, because if we say misinformation is inaccurate information or wrong information, then that assumes that there is accurate and right information. So you do the split. So you sort of dichotomize it. So you either, this is correct and true, and then everything else that isn't is false, wrong, inaccurate, and all sort of falls into the camp of misinformation. There's a kind of added curious element, which is where distinctions are made between misinformation and disinformation. So the idea is that we have something that's true, and then we have something that isn't true. It's all false. And that false stuff is either communicated out deliberately, in which case it's disinformation, or we just by accident are inaccurate, and so that's misinformation. Right? So one assumes there's an intention behind introducing information that's wrong, and the other sort of accepts that people just are a little bit inaccurate sometimes, and so they communicate stuff that isn't true. But then what falls in the kind of general illustrations of what's not true is, I mean, like, so you could say, well, the number of neurons in the brain are, I don't know, 50 billion. That's probably wrong. But let's say it's right. So if I can then say, oh, well, it's actually, no, someone else comes along and says, no, it's 90 billion, but that's actually wrong. Well, what's the range of wrongness? So you just draw the line, you go, no, that's all wrong. All of it, even if it's like a tiny bit out, it's all wrong. You see, well, okay. So you already get into a headache there. Well, you need to specify what is an acceptable level of deviance from truth, right? And then I'll stop after this, which is that different theorists have come up with a variety of ways in which you say, well, these are the constituents of truth, and they're different from falsity, and these are the things that or there's a gradient. There are ranges of what could be construed as true statements, or what is the truth, and it's actually on a continuum to the extreme level of falsity, right? So that's only the first bit of the three things that I've highlighted that are problematic. So in a nutshell, then, given what you asked, which is, well, what is misinformation? I mean, by consensus amongst many theorists and psychologists and social and so on, there's lots of disciplines that are now interested in this. So the community will say it's information that is inaccurate, or false, and disinformation is the communication of false or inaccurate information deliberately designed to mislead.
Okay, so I interrupted you with your flow of three. So the first one is, well, can we identify what it is? And you've given us a sense of that. And I want to come back and explore that a little bit more, but I think it's helpful to have the complete framework of challenge looking at. So then move us into that second and third phase again.
Okay, well, so let's make things a bit more concrete. So let's think about a claim, because a lot of the worry at the moment is around sort of particular claims that are made, either scientific claims or ones to do with political claim, whatever. Like, take your pick. So let's say that claim is out there that's swimming in the world, and and the claim is that the more house plants that you have, or plants in your flat, wherever you're living, the more plants you have, the smarter you become. So let's say that's the headline story that's kind of going around. So one might worry someone's going to go and do something about that. So they'll not only will they encounter the claim, they'll share it with other people, mostly on social media, because that's where the worry is, that everyone's sharing all of this stuff more on social media. So, it's like, so it goes viral. Everybody's like, so that you might think, well, this is a new claim. So it doesn't fit with any prior beliefs that I have. So it's introducing something new. So this is the bit that sort of, in terms of what is it doing in people's heads? Is it introducing something totally new? Or is it simply reinforcing something that people sort of believe that might be sort of a bit shonky? So then the worry would be, well, people are just going to go out and buy loads of houseplants in the hope that they'll end up being smarter. So then you can sort of trace the logic of this, which is there's a false claim that's introduced into the world. It goes viral because it has to be shared for us to worry about the implications of any claim that's wrong. People, it has to be sticky, it has to be of interest to people. It will change their beliefs in some way. So to start with, people didn't have any belief about the connection between houseplants and intelligence. So they're somehow persuaded by that. And then they go out and they buy, in this case, a load of plants in the hope that they'll be smarter, right? So it has to be salient. It has to change someone's belief. And then the assumption is the belief then is the trigger for changing people's behavior. And in the context of, the climate we're in now, people are worrying about sort of claims that might be harmful in some way to the individual society. So that's basically what we're working on. If you sort of go, right, well, what's the logic of all of this? What is required? So those are the minimum requirements.
And of course, there's I was just, as you were talking, my mind was racing. Of course, so there's the people buy more plants thing. There's, I don't know, people that already have lots of plants think they are more intelligent as a result of it. I could see people like hanging out in garden centers because it might make you cleverer by osmosis or whatever. So there's all these additional things. But your point is, it's something that is starts to be widely believed, right? Because one or two people implicit in what you're saying doesn't matter. But if this thing is disseminated widely and it changes people's behavior in some way, shape, or form, then that's what we're focusing on here. And so the question, I guess, you're looking at is to say, okay, we've identified what it is and what it might do. Is that a problem?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because so people have to, in theory, go along with what we're saying in terms of the kind of the argument, the logic of it. So to the extent that people go, yeah, okay, roughly something along the lines of what you said is what we're kind of expecting, which is why we're worrying. Because you can kind of rearrange some of the factors that I mentioned, which is that you could introduce a claim. I mean, there's varying degrees to which people will find that plausible or interesting. And it could be that either it introduces something new or they have prior beliefs and they're looking for particular claims that fit with their beliefs. So the beliefs already exist. You think I nominally had an idea that there was a relationship between my environment and my IQ. And this is just something that is kind of a bit quirky, but it reinforces what I already thought, right? So in which case the assumption is that prior beliefs already exist in people's minds, and what you're doing is just snatching at headlines that might go viral that confirm what you already know. But in one case, one way or another, whichever of those ways of thinking about the influence of misinformation on beliefs is beliefs have a direct effect on your behavior. So then if you look under the hood in terms of what goes on in psychology, and this is partly why I got interested in this area, because and also what we've talked about before, which is it's notoriously difficult to change people's behavior. Especially if it's behavior that might benefit them, right? So if you're in the habit of doing particular things that may be fun but not good for you, and you have a whole load of behavioral interventions that are designed to actually persuade you out of what you're doing, they don't work very well, right? So in my most charitable description of what goes on in the world of behavioral change, I could say, they sort of maybe work under some very minimal conditions, but not consistently, not that you put money on it working every time. So what I mean is like a nudge, or you change the way you order various things in a canteen, or any of the other stuff that people hopefully know about. So the point there is that if you try to change their beliefs, that in order to change their behavior, the association between the two isn't reliable. It isn't reliable anyway, irrespective of whether you're actually trying to change behavior. So psychology will tell you, in which there are thousands and thousands of studies over a long period of time, that there is a very tenuous connection between people's beliefs and their actions, like, because there's lots of other things that kind of intervene to explain why the association between the two can be very weak. It's not to mean that, so I'm not saying that beliefs don't influence behavior at all. It's just that a direct causal relationship between the two is really hard to find. So here's another example. So everyone lost their minds at some point in history when there were kind of violent video games. So do you remember there was a time I was like, oh,
I'm aware of them.
yeah. There was like,
I may or may not have played them, right?
let's ban them. Let's ban them because, particularly for teenagers, we need to ban them because they're leading to an influx of violent behaviors and aggression in, let's say, teenagers, and also particularly in America, where there was a worry that school shootings were the direct result of just more exposure. So interestingly, if you look at the history of any media, be it, I was quite staggered when I saw this. So comics, when comics entered into the world, there was a worry that comics would lead to kind of an outbreaks of violence because some of the stories were, violent. Same goes with radio. Same goes with television. You can see the pattern here, which is that, once something new happens, a new technology, which gives access to people of things that, they might not normally have encountered, the assumption is that then all hell breaks loose. It turns out that actually longitudinal studies, very, very careful longitudinal studies, show that the link between exposure to violent video games and increases in aggression and violent behavior is weak to nothing, because it's explained by lots of other things, right? So you take into account socioeconomic background, you take into account, violent exposure to violent behavior in the home and so on, all of those things, then once you think about it, that kind of makes sense. All of these other factors would probably play a role, because it's not like on aggregate everybody's suddenly that much more violent, especially when there's work that shows that it's going in the opposite direction societally. Anyway, so the point there is, the assumption is you're exposed to something, in this case a violent video game, it introduces new beliefs, and those new beliefs mean that you're then going to go out and act on them. And the evidence didn't show that, right? So by analogy, if you go, well, you're encountering some news article that is presenting you something which is false, then your belief changes as a result of that. So then therefore your behavior is automatically going to change as a result of that. So that those aren't givens. That it's not a given that just because you're going to read something or you're going to hear some gossipy nonsense, which will be fun, that you then go, oh, right, well, I better, I'm going to go off and do something in whichever direction, because you can't also predict the direction in which the bad behaviors, assuming that they're going to result from misinformation, are going to occur. You can only find it after the fact. And then if you go after the fact, oh, well, we knew that this bad behavior is the result of, this one piece of misinformation and not all of the other potential factors that could be intervening.
So in other words, you're basically saying we believe that humans are fallible and easily influenced. And so if we take a context like video games, right, there's a presumption that's going to make people violent. So that's a bad thing, right? Because we see violence, we draw that connection. And so your point here is that misinformation, we're attributing far too much power to that. And therefore we need to apply the logic that we might apply to other things and say, yeah, okay, it might have an influence, but you're looking at a pattern set that you have to have had, as you say, you have to have had a change of behavior that is going to be concerning, and therefore you go back and say, well, what might have caused that? I can pin it on this thing because I like that simple link of course, this is going to be influential.
And yeah, exactly. I mean, so you could say, well, there's 5 potential factors. I mean, take any particular thing that's happening at the moment that sort of looks like societal unrest. Now, it would be unfair and wrong of me to say that, is it the case that misinformation has no potential influence at all? Well, that's not what I'm saying. It's just, how much, if anything, does it have as a potential influence but over and above 5 or 6 other substantial factors? If you can rule those out, and you say, well, actually, what's tipping things over the edge is the fact that it's this misinformation. Not only that it's the misinformation, it's the fact that everybody believes it, and it's constantly being reinforced in some way, right? Because it's not just, if you look at your news feed, you're going to come across loads of things that going to have misinformation. Like, here's another example, which, again, to make things concrete, maybe about a couple of months ago, I think there was a report from sort of a ruling not a ruling, it was at least a recommendation in Canada about the amount of alcohol you could consume in a week that would be sort of a reasonable amount. And there was actually, if you looked in the news feed, because I checked it at the time, and actually it was updating and changing, because the reports, even from the same newspapers, were changing because they are having to correct their errors, because they were saying, oh, it's 1 day a week. There's once a day. No, it's not. It's once a week. No, it's 2. Maybe some of that was kind of wishful thinking. So you think, well, yeah, there are errors in. Do you think you could forgive? So let's say, to start with, it was misinformation, because if you're assuming misinformation is just inaccurate information, right? So the true information was, let's say, once a week, but actually what was communicated was to 2 or 3 times a week. So then you think, well, how much of that is going to influence people's behavior? Well, if people if people are drinking more than 2 or 3 times a week, they might go, well, I'm not going to scale it back, so I don't care. As it is, they've got it wrong anyway. So that it's gone down to 1. You think, well, that just seems like it's too unreasonable. Or for those that might not drink at all, I'll go, oh, well, actually, once a week might seem like, so just what I mean? It's like, well, how are you going to regulate your behavior? If there's like after 2 months of this news story coming out, you suddenly see a spike in drinking behavior, you might, well, if I can rule out all other things that have happened in that time, seasonal effects, other political kind of, economic factors and so on that might be disruptive, that might make life unpleasant, mean that people want to drink or whatever other, or a celebration, like if it were Christmas or New Year's, you think, well, so do you see what I mean? Like if you rule all possible other things that might explain that the mechanism that would cause that behavior, and you say, well, the only other thing that was left was this claim that was in the news that everybody had read, then fine. Then you could say, well, there's a distortion in the details that are going to influence the amount that people are going to drink. And so there must be something that people encountered that fit with their prior beliefs or changed their beliefs that then changed their behavior.
So you're not saying it has no impact. You're just saying it's possibly we attribute more to it than perhaps we ought to. Is that the point?
Well, I have to be reasonable here, because I would say the reasonable interpretation is to say, does false information have the possibility of influencing people's thinking? Yes. I mean, it would be folly for me to say, no, it doesn't at all.
Right.
But then, but so like, if that's where I'm going to agree with everybody else, then of course, because anyone that's reasonable would say, well, you encounter something that's wrong. It might do something to the way you think about things. It might resonate with you, and so you believe something that's wrong. But to then say that the world as it is at the moment, all of the ills, or at least the vast majority of the ills that influencing the way people are behaving, that is because we're in an infodemic where we're swash with all of this misinformation. Well, okay, are you really saying that is the thing that is tipping everybody into like the chaotic observations that we're seeing in the way people are behaving with each other? Well, no, it just doesn't seem like, because then you'd have to go. So this is what we did in our work, which is, you look historically, any new technology, any new information technology, be it the telegraph or newspapers or radio, or there's always been some form of moral panic associated with that. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry about things and play out the implications of these things. And of course we should, because we need to prepare ourselves in the event that there might be something. But you could think it through. But there's a risk of panicking to such a degree that you introduce measures that are disproportionate to the actual problem itself, when you don't even understand the problem itself.
And so your contention is, right, not zero impact, and there may be examples where it has, because I can think of sort of stories. For example, there's the guy who went on a shooting rampage in the pizzeria in, I think, Washington, because of the paedophile ring that was in the basement that didn't exist. Right. So complete and utter nonsense that he's picked up from somewhere. So that would be an example where I presume you would be turning around to me and going, okay, we clearly, like, you've got to have some underlying mindsets, presumably some sort of mental health condition that's going to prompt you to behave in that way. There may be an argument that says the misinformation that individual received, that's what led them to do that particular thing, and so it has had an impact. But that's either a rare example, or or we look at the under. It's a very small part of it, and so your overall piece is to say not that it doesn't have any impact at all, but that we will overweight the significance it has, and and so the examples that you pulled from history are saying we've done the same thing before. We've feared the impact of additional information on human behavior. Actually, therefore, yes, of course, we should focus on it, but let's not overplay our hand and be massively panicked by this, because we recognize from the past that, yes, it'll have an impact, but not the one that we might think. We attribute too much to it.
Yes. I mean, yeah, in a nutshell. I mean, the other thing is, well, if you were going to regulate in misinformation, which is why I think if we work off the first part, which is where you're sort of saying, where you asked me, well, yeah, do I think there's a problem? Well, does it have any influence? Yeah, because anyone that's reasonable say, yeah, it could have some influence, but it's either going to, in rare cases, it's going to reinforce something which is particularly aberrant. And we're only thinking of the most extreme cases anyway. Like, so when I start off with the example that I did, that's misinformation. Like, if someone's making scientific claim that says, some ridiculous thing that that clearly doesn't have a direct connection with your mind, the amount of plants that you have in where you live, means that you go out, buy a load of plants, or you believe because you've got loads of plants that so that we're not talking at the level of those claims. So we're assuming something about a category of claims that we think are going to have some kind of significant impact. Well, so how are you deciding that? Right? Because how do you decide in advance of all the possible, right? If we can go wrong in the way we present claims to people, because we set the bar so high in terms of what's truth. I said truth is a fact. Well, okay, but people negotiate facts, right? So, so I'm not contesting reality here. I'm not saying the things aren't real, right? So there is a sun, so fact, or a moon, fact. I mean, you can sort of I'm sure there are ways in which you could sort of work around the edges of that, but so there are deviations from fact are everywhere. In fact, you'd be hard pressed not to find deviation from fact, because we talk in kind of fuzzy, imprecise ways. So, well, what category of things do we mean that are misinformation? Because there is something that is thought of in advance, which is these particular claims are the things that we have to worry about, because these are the things that are going to cause people to behave in ways that we don't want, that will be harmful to society and themselves. You think, okay, so what are they? Why them over others? And can you predict in advance what the behaviors will be? Because if you're only looking at the behaviors after the fact and then saying, oh, well, it had to be misinformation, no, because that's where the consequences in terms of the corrections that are being introduced can be disproportionate to what the actual problem is, or it's a convenience. You think, well, the underlying reasons for the problems are just too hard to handle. Whereas it's easier to just regulate what is information and what's presented to people in social media or wherever else. Again, I'm not saying that, the way people present information on social media um, is distorted and can have some degree of influence. Sure, things go viral. Sure. I'm not saying that those things don't happen, but there's a wealth of stuff that's not correct. Right? It's not fact. So, in anything that I just said to you, and the same goes for any person that you're talking to on the podcast, they'll say things that are moderately inaccurate. Like, they're not trying to be inaccurate. Some of it is because, they're trying to make what they're saying accessible. So they're going to work around the edges of the precision of the things that they're going to say. So you think, well, what bar do you want to set in terms of a fact checking? As people go, oh no, when you said it was 2 meters, it wasn't, it was like 1.57. Do you see what I mean? It's like, what level of accuracy? We don't do that conversation. Right? We don't do that in lots of, so it's more like,
well, otherwise you'd never finish a maths class, right? Because the teacher wouldn't get to the end of pi.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay, we sort of nominally accept some degree of imprecision just for the sake of being practical. But so then you're only left with something slightly more kind of rigorous in terms of definition, which is the disinformation stuff, which is basically people introducing information that's false deliberately to mislead. You think, well, but what about sarcasm? What about irony? What about, satire? So that's in that same camp, right? So then you think, well, no, it has to. So it's like once you face the reality of the day-to-day stuff that we do, then you confront the difficulties of having to, in some cases, prove intent. I think, well, the intent is malicious, right? So the claim, I think, well, is me saying, people should fill their house with loads of plants to make themselves smart and malicious. I mean, it's yes, I have deliberately introduced it as a false claim. See, well, that's less problematic because it doesn't have a significant consequence in terms of harm, right? So then we have to think about claims that might be introduced and that could go viral that are going to incite violence. But that's already a problem because it's inciting violence. It's not, do you see what I mean? It's like, well, the worry isn't that it's a misinformation. It's something that's designed so there are elements of things that are consequential that don't have to sort of be muddied by a problem to do with misinformation or disinformation, because the bar for what is misinformation is either high or low, because you have to know what's inaccurate, and that you have to show intent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But the counter argument, I guess, would be you're just saying this is hard. And there are lots of things that are hard that we have to regulate and deal with. And we don't shy away from those because it's difficult to deal with. We have to focus on it. And you're almost pointing towards a thing going, this is a difficult thing to do. And if we start curtailing information flow, that has negative consequences. So if I were to sort of stereotype and characterize what you're saying in a personality, it's almost the Elon Musk sort of what's happening with Twitter at the moment, right? Which is kind of like it used to be controlled to some extent. And now the wheels seem to be coming off slightly. And so you can see in some quarters, and I try and avoid those quarters, that it's a bit like a sewer. And that all sorts of, I mean, quite literally crap flows there. And some of it's offensive, some of it's missing. And so where do we start to draw that line? Is your point actually that the misinformation isn't the issue? And so we need to think about there's other things like ethics and offending people and those sorts of things that are different to this. But as it seems to me is that you're pointing towards saying this is a challenging issue and the downsides of curtailing it are greater than the downsides of letting it go free. And I wonder how that squares with what we see on social, some of the negative stuff we see on social media.
I mean, it is, yeah, it's not, it sounds, when you say it that way, it sounds quite trite. In the, my argument is, well, it's a bit difficult. It's a bit tricky. That's it. Although that's not actually what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And it can be construed that way, which is why it's fair enough that you said that. It's not, well, there's many things that I spend my time researching on which are equally difficult, and I wouldn't shy away from looking at those.
Right.
So that's not the point.
And it's almost because you're not intellectually lazy, right? So there's lots of people out there who go, I'll put that in the too difficult box, and you're not that kind of person. So that's why I'm sort of intrigued by this, because it's been very clear from your previous period, you think about stuff in a lot of, and you're willing to dive into that complexity. So there's a little bit of me that when I characterize it in that way, I'm being slightly provocative, obviously.
Yeah.
But I'm also just I'm intrigued by it, because that's not something that from all of our discussions in the past, I've not seen you kind of paint something to go, this is quite challenging. And this is, I think this is the I don't disagree with you, it's challenging, but this is the mental leap that is to say, well, I'm suggesting that you're shying away from it because it's challenging. I'm just intrigued by that.
Well, I mean, it's challenging because it's absurd. That's why, if you want to, kind of provoke me to sort of respond, you think, well, ultimately, if you can't say, then to go back to, the logic, so if we say, right, what's not true, so we're going to stop stuff that's just not true. Okay, good luck with that. Because you just, everything else is true. Right. Okay. Everything else is true right now. But when we run experiments, and the consensus from society, from the scientific community tells us that actually we got things a bit wrong and we need to update that. So when were we right?
Right.
So see, well, no, but then that's information. It's like, well, the scientific discoveries happen every day. So it was like, no, now it's right. No, now it's right. Not no, now. Right. So, well, okay. So let's be somewhat. I mean, the thing is, I'm taking it to ad absurd.
Yeah.
Because it's necessary in this case. Because the consequences and the stakes are actually exceptionally high. See, right. Okay. Well, we make this discovery, we show that actually the risks associated with, this new technology is, the chances of someone dying is 1 in 100. Oh my God, that's actually terrible. No, well, look, we've trialed it out. Now it's 1 in 1,000. We trialed it again. It's 1 in, right. So what point was it false? Because that if that thing then goes into the world and people buy it and they're exposed to the risk, at what point was anyone contesting what was the product goes out, people buy it, the technology, whatever it's medical, it could be anything, and then there's associated risk with it. Actually, we wouldn't put it on the market if the risks were very high and the chances of being maimed or killed would be 1 in 100. Like, reputationally, your business would tank. You would do that. So you're right. Okay, well, we're looking at 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million, right? So because that's not a trivial difference. See, well, it's 1 in a million. So that's the claim. Actually, it was false, because then loads of people tested it afterwards, and it turns out that it's actually a lot higher than that. So the risks are actually 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 500,000. So at what point, if you said, well, anyone contesting this at any one time is the purveyor of misinformation, so then what are the consequences of that? Well, we ban you, or whatever other stuff, like, depending on, do you see what I mean? How consequential it is. So that's for things that were tangible, and measurable, that you could potentially be wrong. So you think, well, okay, then somehow you have to go, well, there's a buffer. There's, to some degree, we know that, which is why you get, when there's communication of risk, you sort of get, bands, like there's a benchmark from this to this, or a scale, so with attached uncertainties with it. So if that's the reality, now I'm not saying that you shy away from those who are required, because of the nature of their job, to be as accurate as possible. And for anyone that is a nefarious actor that is going to make, either profit from distorting facts, to bear some consequences, especially if those consequences mean that, people are exposed to harm. Sure. No, would never contest that anyway. But that's an entirely different thing to go, well, no, we know in advance that that's misinformation. So anybody that is actually communicating that is banned from saying anything, right? So that's where you push all of that to the logical conclusion, and it's absurd.
Yeah, I find this really fascinating because the start point that I had is like, oh, it's a bad thing if people are misled, right? We mustn't, we've got to stop this thing. And then you get, as you often do, to the nitty gritty of, well, hold on a minute, right? So if I look at sort of the let's create a regulator, a misinformation regulator, right? Who's there to stop these bad things from happening. As you rightly point out, right? The consequences of doing it go way beyond that. It's really difficult to do it in practical terms. And actually, is it worthwhile, right? Would we invest? So let's ignore the sort of unintended consequences of it. Right? It's a massive task that would require a huge amount of effort that we get wrong. And so ultimately you put it all together. And so I guess your overriding message is that when we think about the concept of misinformation, is we've got to be very, very careful not to overstate the significance it has, and to not use that as a lightning conductor for all the other problems that are going on. And the risks that you implicitly see is that people aren't thinking in those terms, and that there is a move potentially to regulate this, whatever that means, and that you see as a risk.
Yes. Here's another way of thinking about it, again, in sort of slightly practical terms, which is that every newspaper, one assumes that if you're reading a newspaper, either newspaper articles online, or, the actual paper itself online, or you buy it, a hard copy, that it's going to be biased, right? So because which ones are left or right leaning, whatever that means these days. And so there is a tilt. See, but is that going to be a distortion? So, well, yeah, to a degree, it's a filter by which, the editor and the newspaper in general is kind of signaling to its readership. But you'd say on the whole, the facts that are going to be presented in the newspaper, in the articles themselves, you'd expect, given the standards of journalism, there should be high. Now, in that, and there's always been a history of this, there have been obviously corrections. So the newspaper regularly will include corrections. I don't know how frequently it is, like maybe daily, maybe weekly, so that that, blah, blah, blah article published, and these errors were, either highlighted by the public or the journalists know themselves. And also because the news cycle is one that sort of changes so frequently, the updates are frequent as well. See, well, then how are you going to hold them to account if you say, well, they're presenting things that are inaccurate? So at the time, there'll be some content in there that will be inaccurate because the next day or the next week, it will be corrected because they'll highlight the errors. So, we'll relax it in that case. Why? Because we're assuming that people are going to self-correct anyway, especially where it's at stake when you're communicating things. Right, so there's an acceptance that the effort is to not mislead, to communicate accurately, because the costs are high, given the profession you're in. Right, so that those standards are somewhat in place anyway. it's different on social media, but then, actually the findings in terms of, what people use social media for and communicating things and, the effects it has in the real world is actually a lot more tenuous. It's not necessarily publicized findings because it's completely unintuitive to what we want, we're led to believe, which is it's rife with nonsense, sure. And it makes us go out and sort of punch people in the face, frequently, or stab them, or whatever other, like, even worse things than that. I'm not saying that it doesn't have that capacity. It's just that, the magnitude of the problem, you have to be really careful about the magnitude of the problem and where you consider the consequences. Because, going back to the newspapers, you're not going to over-regulate, or are you, the newspapers, if the assumption is, well, we already know that they're misinforming us because they're already constantly correcting the articles that they're publishing. So, as a point of contrast.
There's an interesting sort of implicit logic in some of what you're saying, which is that that either we have the structures in place to protect us, right? So newspapers, if it turns out newspapers are constantly printing crap, then people won't read them, right? Because you go, why am I reading this nonsense, right? I don't want to be lied to the whole time. So there's a sort of, if you like, there's an implicit calibration that goes on there. And you're sort of suggesting, it seems to me, that that structures like that, and also the fact that we don't like being lied to generally. And so when we find out that we've been lied to, we would then shy away from that source and go somewhere else. That almost it becomes self-regulating. And therefore, yes, it's a concern on some level, but human beings, I get, is it that human beings are smart enough to work this stuff out and that eventually all things come good? And so when we worry about misinformation, there might be a short time period where it can be more influential than others, but we'll work out that's in the same way that we work out that so-and-so is unreliable. And we sort of sort that out, and we have the critical faculties to deal with it. Are you going in that direction, or is that too far?
Yeah, I mean, this, I have to kind of fess up here, which is that, it also plays into, in anyone that's going to look into this kind of stuff or any particular scientific pursuit is, it's very hard to abstract their own personal interest and their own, slant, in the same way as a newspaper is slanted in one, towards one political leaning and another. Academics are sort of similar in this respect. Does that, interfere with the findings that are generated from the studies I conduct? I mean, hopefully not, because, what I use is the scientific method, which in theory is supposed to, protect from that. The reason why I sort of, add all of this in, which is that as someone that is enormously skeptical, just generally, then I'm going to be especially skeptical, and I will scrutinize that much more something that just seems that much more consequential.
Right.
And consequential, and that is so fuzzy and loose as an idea. See, well, if I'm going to spend the time looking at this, then and I'm not even trying to overcomplicate. It's the opposite. I'm trying to make it simple. So that's why I started off. It's like, here's the three basic elements. We understand what the term is. We assume that it changes people's minds in some way. And what is the contents of their mind will then influence their behavior. Do we have any consistent findings that will show that, irrespective, as a causal link, not correlation? Because what we've got so far is very intuitive correlational evidence, not anything that is concretely causal. So from that point of view, well, and being someone that is somewhat skeptical anyway, this is the kind of, these are the ingredients that go into the mix in me saying the things that I'm saying. So I'm not shying away from the idea that regulation should be in place for lots of reasons that I'm interested in. I wouldn't ever say, no, we shouldn't do that. It's just, when we're wading into something that actually has profound effects on what we can communicate with each other, you better be damn sure that the claims you're making about the consequences and the causes of those things are as they are. And it seems not. At least from my point of view.
Love it. And I guess final question. I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating is that we seem to live in a society where we put protections in place where it seems a bit excessive. So if I think about, for example, coffee cups that have warnings that the coffee, the contents of the cup may be hot, right? Or hot apple pies, we get told that they may be, right? That seems to me to be overreach and ridiculous. And we see lots of examples of sort of stupid, what, and there's perfectly sensible health and safety requirements, but then there's idiotic things that go to an extremity. And so really, I think what you seem to be suggesting here is that we need to allow a bit of human common sense. And that there's a danger here that if we do start to go down this path, and I guess we're already starting because we're having the discussion, that we could take that too far. And I guess then the second piece I'm thinking about is critical thinking and the importance of critical thinking and whether we're equipping people with that. So sort of interested in your thoughts on sort of the nanny state, I guess, for want of a better phrase, and then the second, the importance of critical thinking.
I mean, the nanny states, yeah, sure. I mean, and also you have to kind of look at, well, why are these things in place that seem kind of exceptionally excessive? So, warning labels are just, a good example of this.
Well, nuts that may contain nuts.
Yeah, exactly. All that, yeah. And I had actually looked into this. So, because the idea was if we add some more labels to packaged food, then we can, help people do this or that. So I looked at the kind of current number of labels that exist on packages. The thing is that, sometimes I do these things. I think surely it should be obvious that people would think to do the same thing, but it turns out not so. So it's like, well, maybe before you kind of think about adding another label, it might be worth having looking at what labels already exist. It's like, well, it's actually an incredibly crowded place on the front of packs, which is the most salient. Then least salient is the backs. People just don't bother with it. And you're only going to get very few who bother looking at the nutritional stuff on there. So, you're going to add another label. Is that going to be crowded out by all of the others? It's like, yeah, of course, because if you look at, which is the other thing I do, it's like, what's the average time that people spend anywhere when they're buying something? Not long. So if you distribute the amount of time by the amount of, in theory, attention that they would direct towards any packet of something that they buy, it's going to be a matter of seconds. So the only things that people pay attention to is price, like branding and promotional offers, primarily. So then you think, well, what's the reason for adding another label then? You think, well, there are other potential reasons. Some you could say, some would be good, but virtuous reasons. It's just they're not going to go anywhere. So that is kind of partly explaining away some of the problems with the nanny state. Right? So you think sometimes things just have to be there for the sake of being there, even though they're not actually going to do anything. The extent to which people actually respond or behave to that is, in some ways, all of the stuff that is ever talked about on your podcast, which is all of the kind of behavioral things that make it easier for people to just ignore stuff or make it introduce efficiency. What was the second?
Critical thinking was.
Oh, yeah,
because implicit in fascinating. We'll come back to the labeling subject another time because I'm really intrigued by that. But the second bit was implicit in it's not as impactful as we might think, is that we have the capability to think critically. And one of the things I think is questionable is whether the education system that the average person goes through is giving them enough of a steer in that direction. And so, yes, we're all born with the ability. Children question everything, but as we look at people growing up, I think we can see that there are some people that don't always display critical thinking capabilities.
Well, let me tie that to the previous point, which is that if you treat people stupidly, then they'll end up, the upper limit of what they can do is mostly stupid. So, well, do people have critical thinking capacities? Yes. Do they need to be a bit more literate about various things? I mean, sure, but to the extent that those things have consequences, then the people need to be a bit more equipped. And then it's the responsibility of those who are practitioners to make it easier for people so that, they can think critically without having to kind of wade through, doing a whole load of homework, which is not what they should do. But if yes, I was being facetious, but I also mean it in that what I notice is that there is that people aren't expected to do sort of to think through in the ways that they actually can. So if you don't treat them that way, then what you're going to get back is a reflection of just, being stupid. Because, I can't do anything. I can't express myself in any way that looks like I'm more sophisticated than you think that I am. So, so my view would be assume that people actually have a lot more competence, and some of them won't, and some of them will struggle. But it's better that, because then you can raise the bar rather than just assume that everybody's incompetent.
I love that. As a closing phrase, that is absolutely fabulous. As ever, Magda, my head is about to explode in a really, really good way. So I want to say thank you so much for what you do, right? Because I think it's interesting, and that sense of curiosity, and as we saw when we just dived into labels a little bit, diving into rabbit holes and thinking about stuff is what you do so well. And it's why it's just an absolute pleasure to talk to you and just hear the infectious way that you think about things and challenge things. And I absolutely love that. It's been absolutely fascinating as ever. So thank you so much. Links to you, your research, all those sorts of things in the show notes. But all that remains for me to say is thank you so much for once again being on the show.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Magda for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Magda and her research, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. There are also links to her previous 3 appearances on the podcast, where she's talked about compliance, coercion and competence, behavioural interventions that failed and what we can learn from them, and unconscious bias. There's also a link to the episode I recorded with another Cambridge professor, Sander van der Linden, talking about the same subject. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, please do. It really does help. And finally, another reminder that my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out now. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show. But in the meantime, stay safe, look out for misinformation, and thank you so much for listening.